Hi, everyone. My name's Osa Katchen, and I'm the chair of the Canadian Urban Libraries Council. I am very pleased to welcome all of you as we celebrate this year's selection for One eRead, Un Livrel Canada, Valid by Chris Bergeron. One eRead, Un Livrel makes it possible for Canadians to access a nationwide bilingual digital book club via their public library. And it highlights the important role that libraries play in providing equitable access to a wide range of digital materials, while also raising awareness of the high costs and restricted licenses libraries face when purchasing ebooks and audiobooks. Each year, One eRead Un Livrel introduces Canadian readers and listeners to new Canadian books and authors by our small independent publishers. While we hope you all enjoy reading Valid with no wait lists for the month of April, we encourage you to use and borrow from your public libraries year-round and support libraries' efforts to expand access to digital books. I am thrilled that we will have the opportunity to hear from Chris at this year's events. Thank you to our friends at the Ottawa Public Library for organizing this year's English program, and to our friends at CBC for hosting the event. I look forward to learning more about the inspiration behind and the process of writing Valid. And on behalf of the Canadian Urban Libraries Council, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you for joining us this evening. Thank you for reading, and please enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, Osa. Kwekakina, hello everyone, et bienvenue. It's important to acknowledge that even as we gather virtually, I am currently on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. De nos jours, divers peuples de Premières Nations, des Inuits et des Métis vivent, travaillent et étudient sur ce territoire. I'm Sonia Bevington, and I'm Chief Librarian and CEO of Ottawa Public Library and a proud member of the Canadian Urban Libraries Council. I'm so pleased to welcome you to tonight's One eRead, Un Livrel Canada event, a national celebration of Canadian literature and the power of equitable access to great e-reads. This year's featured title is Valid by Chris Bergeron. Valid is set in a dystopian near future where surveillance capitalism dominates our lives and algorithms govern civil society. Like classic works of similar themes from 1984 all the way to Kazuo Ishiguro, Valid explores how we can resist the appropriation of our private lives and experiences and their reduction to data points only to be used to control our self and creative expression, purchasing power, and access to information. Valid was originally published in French as Valide, and it received critical acclaim in Quebec for its imaginative storytelling and poignant reflections on gender, identity, and resistance. The book has since been translated into multiple languages, notably into English by Natalia Hero, and continues to spark important conversations wherever it's read. We're incredibly fortunate to be joined by Chris this evening, along with our host, Matea Roach, a familiar voice to many as the host of Bookends, the CBC radio show and podcast. With Matea's insight and Chris's powerful storytelling, tonight's discussion promises to be both engaging and meaningful. One eRead, Un Livrel Canada is more than just a book club. It's about supporting a culture of reading, raising awareness about access to ebooks across languages and across geography. So thank you for joining us and being part of this important dialogue. There will be an opportunity for you to ask your questions during a Q&A session towards the end of the conversation. But for now, it is my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's guests, author Chris Bergeron and our host, Matea Roach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for that introduction. That takes a lot of the lift off of my plate in terms of introducing the author and the book and what we're going to be talking about today. I am so excited to speak with Chris about this book. I think there is such a timeliness to talking about really everything that this book delves into at this specific moment. Chris, it's so great to meet you virtually, and congratulations on being chosen for One eRead Canada. How does it feel to have this book being promoted and celebrated in libraries across the country?
It's wonderful, and it's especially meaningful, I find this year. I wrote the book in French in 2020. It came out in 2021 in French. And we weren't living in the same reality as we are today. And there was going to be the conversation around queer literature in libraries and the presence that it should or shouldn't have in public libraries wasn't as fraught with very difficult debates as it is today. So the fact that librarians from across the country decided to give a nod to my book and share it to their audiences in their communities is, I think, a great sign of open-mindedness, and it reminds me of what this country is about.
Mm. So, your book, Valid, takes place as an 8-hour conversation between your main character, Christelle, and an AI, David. And this is described as a work of dystopian autofiction. It's set in this kind of future. It's a character that I think is drawing a lot from your own experiences. But this main character, Christelle, is a 70-year-old trans woman who is in a situation where she's forced to live as a man and she's kind of re-entered the closet, so to speak.
Yeah.
What are the circumstances that have led her to closet herself and live as Christian when we first meet her?
One of the things I was noticing way back during the pandemic when I was writing and most of the book was that people were talking about the safety and the well-being of a majority of people, and not so much about the particulars in terms of health. And so I imagined if we lived in a world that went from crisis to crisis, or at least if that was the public message, the rights and the needs of minority groups would be ignored. And in fact, it's what we are seeing today as political discourse. It's almost a way to get elected today. And so, in that world, in that extrapolation of the world we're seeing today, I imagined a world where essentially not only were rights not so much validated to use the word, but actually removed. And
Mm.
anything that stood out of the sort of average or the common point of view of what should be a perfect citizen would be erased. And in order to survive and actually be able to be on the good side of whatever authority is in the book, my character has to detransition, but it's something that exists in today's world. I can imagine somebody who is trans right now living in Russia, where it's essentially been criminalized to be trans, to detransition. So it's a reality that has existed in the past and exists today and will probably continue to exist in the future.
Mm. I'm curious, why do you think it is that, as you say, these minority groups in times of crisis, you cite a pandemic, for instance, there's also talk of climate crisis in this novel. Minority groups are often pointed out as scapegoats in these times of crisis that affect societies writ large
Mhm.
and have their rights stripped. And we see that process playing out in your novel. Why do you think it is that this is often a tactic that gets deployed against marginalized groups of people when all of society is experiencing some sort of cataclysm?
Two things happen, right? One is simply forgetting, not having, it's a logistical issue. Let's say it's World War II and you have to fight against Hitler. That's the that's the battle that everybody needs to fight, right? So if there's a virus, that's the battle. If there's a fire, a forest fire, that's the battle, and you don't really care so much. Or logistically, it's hard to be flexible enough and to sort of imagine every scenario for every person and every type of person. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is in times of great challenges, um, a lot of governments and politicians are actually not at the level required by the challenge. And we see that in a lot of North American politics, right? They don't know how to deal with the cost of living. They don't know how to deal with climate change. They don't know how to deal with large, movements of population. None of that they actually have solutions for. So they create a scapegoat. And then so it's easy to create moral panics because the time you spend with that moral panic is actually time that you're not spending explaining what you should be doing in order to keep us all safe.
Mm. I want to talk a bit about the style that you used in writing Valid because it's written in this monologue style where most of it is essentially your main character, Christelle, telling her life story from her childhood into her adulthood as now like an elderly, closeted trans woman. It's a very unique way of telling a story. Why did you choose to craft the narrative in this way?
It's funny, it really comes back to how the book actually started. I was giving, and I still give talks across the country, talking about what it's like to be trans and what the experience is and what the experience is at work and some of the challenges I've faced, all of that. And my publisher actually um, came to one of these talks and we chatted after and she said, "Oh, you should write a book about all that." And so I started with this autobiography and very quickly realized that that book had been written before, right? The story of a trans person, a coming of age story, how I came out of the closet and I this and that. And I thought, oh, really, like, what's the point of that book if it's been done before? And I figured that it would be more interesting if I used the book as an opportunity to exercise my fears and, tackle the big question, which is how will I age? And is there a possibility of a happy old age for a trans person when the world is going to hell, in a handbasket, so to say.
Mm,
So, and that's where I thought, okay, I might have something new here with this notion of dystopian autofiction, projecting myself into the future and asking myself, how would I react? And obviously, I position myself as a coward because very few of us are actual heroes.
mm. I'm curious, like you're talking about this being a way of almost processing fear of the future and what it means to age at all in a society that seems to be moving from crisis to crisis, and especially what it means to age as a trans person. What are some of the things that you, just as a person, are worried about that you felt you might want to process or might need to process through writing fiction?
Well, there were a few things. One is the fact, first of all, that there are no models. I don't know what an elder, I mean, I'm going to be 50 this year, and that's considered elder trends. But in the straight world, that's not considered that old. I mean, it's old-ish. Right?
Middle-aged, you know, is
Old-ish,
yeah,
right?
you're kind of halfway there.
I'm halfway there. I mean, but certainly the trans community, it's considered old, and so that means that there's actually very few examples of trans people in their 70s and 80s that actually have a life that goes beyond struggle, right? So that was my fear. Is that the life I'm going to have? That's fear one. Fear two is, will there, will it be an old age of loneliness, which I think is something a lot of queer people fear, will I be with somebody, there might not be children, there might be, so will I be alone? And then there's this conversation that's happening, I think increasingly about queer people in old people homes and, in these sort of institutions and how they go back into the closet often because of the people that are there around them. And so that too is a fear. And it's very different because I think if you know, I'm a VP in the largest ad agency in Canada, and I look at my straight colleagues around me, and if I ask them what will be your life at 60 and 70, they will talk about retirement and having a chalet somewhere, and well, they would say moving down to Florida, but that's probably not the case anymore. But you know what I mean? Something typical, and I just don't see that for me.
Hmm.
I can't visualize it.
It's interesting the sort of telling of trans life stories and oral storytelling practices
Mhm.
is something that you're doing in this novel. And I would say that oral storytelling and recounting one's life is a big part of queer culture. Like, I think oral history is a huge part of how queer history ends up getting transmitted. And you take some time to dive into trans history and queer and trans subcultures in this book, almost like your narrator is educating the algorithm of like, here are some things that you actually should really know about what ball culture was like, for instance, in the
Yeah,
90s and in through the 21st century. Was was there a sense of writing this as an educational text for you at all? Like, was there any sense that you were going to write this and people were going to like learn something about actual trans lives that are being lived out in the present through reading your work?
for sure. I mean, and it's funny, it depends on the audience, right? I mean, obviously, if you're trans and you read Valid, you might actually say, "Oh, well, I know all this already." And so then you'll focus on something else, another part of the book, right? And then people that aren't from the various communities that live under the queer umbrella, they discover a lot of things. They learn about the ball culture, and they learn about, and there are things that, and I try to be very careful in the way I present it. I'm certainly not saying that I was everywhere. It's not like I'm sort of trans Forrest Gump, where it's like, and here I was at Stonewall, and here I was at this, and no, right? That's not how I position it. I actually position it as a trans person that actually was old enough to even be surprised by this sense of community, right? And a lot of trans people my age haven't had those great, especially in Canada, where ball culture is not something, it's something that has been revived, I think, and introduced in the recent years in Canada. But it used to be something else here. It used to be more gay clubs and whatever, and that was a whole different world, and drag bars and all of that. And so I try to imagine and describe what the scene was and how I fit into it or not fit into it, depending on my character's evolution.
Mhm. There's an interesting thing that goes on in this book, I think, where you're speaking sort of to queer and trans people and then also speaking to straight people, I think, in this novel and also in a lot of the work that you do. Because as you mentioned, you give talks in your professional life about your experience as a trans person. Do you find yourself often kind of shifting the way that you talk about your own life experience depending on what sort of an audience you're trying to reach?
I try not to be honest. I mean,
Mm,
if it's talking about my life, that's a factual thing, right? This happened and that happened, and that's how I felt. I try to not go, beyond that, because then I would be presuming things about the world, and
hmm
so I try to focus on what the experience was. So no, but what I found, though, perhaps, is the reception of my book varies on really on who's reading it, right? Somebody who's straight who reads it will read it like 1984, will read it like a piece of, like, a warning. Let's make sure this doesn't happen. Somebody who is queer and trans and reads this and says, "Oh, this has already happened and is happening right now," right?
mm,
But then I've also had people say, "Why you? Why are you writing this book and not somebody else? What makes you so special?" And that's people from the community, because we also tend to be very hard on ourselves in this community, I find, right? So sometimes when I speak, I I try to make sure my that I'm not misunderstood. Let's just say that.
hmm It's a difficult thing. I do want to return to that idea of like who gets to speak for queer and trans communities later on, because I think that's such a fraught question that you ask any queer or trans person who's really engaged with their community, and they'll have a ton of things to say about it. But before we get into that, I have a lot of thoughts brewing about the relationship between transness and technology in this novel, because this is a sort of future dystopia novel. As you mentioned, you could make some 1984 comparisons in certain elements. we have this relationship between your narrator, Christelle, and David, who's this AI overlord that she's talking to. But Christelle actually draws parallels between herself and David. She says, you know, you're my twin. Manhood is an algorithm that I've had to kind of learn to run myself. And there's sort of these comparisons that are made between the way that the human brain is formulated and the way that computer algorithms are formulated. What are your thoughts on the connection between trans experience and technology? Do you see a connection there?
I think there might be, yeah. And I think a lot of trans writers are I think there's like two great families. There's the sort of Mother Earth family who sort of, right, really talks about emotions and feelings and connection to community in the way we write about it, like people like Ai Chang Tum, for instance, where there's this innate wisdom of connection. And then on the other hand, there's people like me who write about the more um, I guess speculative and technological aspects. And yeah, there's a temptation to look at us like a kind of Frankenstein machine, something that has been taken out of the taken out of sort of natural order to create a new order. Um, and so then the questions of transhumanism and the questions of technology and the questions of am I my body? Can I transcend my body? These are things. It's not a coincidence that the people who did The Matrix were trans women. There's a natural fascination, I think, which probably comes in my own case, I think, comes simply from the dream of not having to suffer from this body. And so as a child, I would imagine being downloaded to a computer and being able to be whoever I want, right? That's the dream for a lot of trans people, I find. And maybe some of us do dream of a moment where you can switch bodies at will. Perhaps it'll happen, but I'm sure if it does happen, it'll be like an Amazon body or something.
Yeah, there'll be some kind of consequences that we
There'll
don't
be
necessarily
consequences. There'll be
want.
ads all over it.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, this idea of the body is something that can be modified and upgraded almost like software, and the ways in which that gets talked about
Mhm.
differently depending on whether it's trans people or cis people doing it. I think one of the big discourses that you see getting thrown around these days is like comparing certain gender affirming care procedures that trans people might undergo to things that cisgender people do to feel more secure about their own bodies, and saying, why do we find it odd that a trans person might want to do this, but when a cis person does it, there's just sort of no, we it's just taken for granted that they would want to do it. I think, I don't know, do you have thoughts on like the relationship between bodies and technology more broadly, or the body as a form of technology?
Maybe the body is a form of technology. Well, or actually, technology is trying to be more like a body, right? When
Mm,
we talk about AI, we talk about neural networks, and we are trying to imitate a brain and replicate neural pathways. We're far from being able to actually do that, but again, that's the blueprint. That's what we're trying to do. That's why people are trying to build quantum computers so that we can have machines that are as fast and as powerful as our brains are, which so far we do not have. And so I think computers are trying to mimic nature, as opposed to us trying to act like computers. And I think as soon as medicine was created, in a sense, as soon as somebody took a plant and ingested it for some kind of benefit or some kind of improvement or some kind of healing, that was technology,
mm,
right? That was us affecting our body. And the technology we conceive as computers and anything are just an extension of that. It's yes, made out of silicon and all of that, and but we're turning into cyborgs. We already are with our cell phones.
mhm. There's also like an element of comedy, I would say, in the way that Christelle interacts with David and the way that she almost pokes fun at him and teases him as she's delivering this monologue. And I'm even saying him. This is a computer algorithm. Like, I'm talking using gendered pronouns as though it's a real guy.
Because he's modeled that way.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's the same as any virtual assistant like Alexa, Siri. Often it's women, actually, in fact, that we talk to as virtual assistants
And
or AI.
that's the decision I made actually,
Oh,
to have
interesting. Tell
David
me
be
more
a
about that.
man, because historically, and I talk about it in the book, historically AI assistants were women when they were assistants, right? Alexa is not AI, not yet, right? It's an assistant. It's the sort of, I guess you would call it conversational software, but it's not yet AI. And then, okay, so that's a woman. But when things start being uh, smart and are at the service of a certain kind of patriarchy, as is the case in my book, then I imagine him as more of a savior type of character,
Hmm.
more like a prophet, more like that's why he gave him a man's name and a biblical name.
Mm.
Because I imagine that one day we may look at AI and see them as the, second coming of some kind of prophet.
I mean, I've seen some distressing just screenshots of people plugging in essentially therapeutic queries to various AI programs,
Sure.
asking for advice or asking for things like dream interpretation, things that we would have thought previously were very spiritual and very fundamentally human,
Yeah.
and feeling like they get these really great responses that are deeply meaningful to them through AI.
Yeah.
I personally don't love that, but evidently there's a certain contingency of people who think that that's great and who do see it as something that's kind of like, well, what could be almost holier than the computer in a way.
In a way, I mean, it's going to be our next priest, probably. In so much as you're not asking a machine, but you're asking the sum of humanity, a summary of humanity within a machine.
Hmm.
So we don't perceive these AIs as being artificial in the sense that everything they do comes from us, right? So it's
Hmm.
as if you're having a conversation with humanity as a whole, with a sort of capital H. What people forget, though, is that there's bias in the way the data sets are chosen. And there's a lot of great writings about that, and that really depends on who is the owner of these machines and these systems, which is, of course, one of the questions in my book, right? Who owns these systems? What are they
Hmm.
for?
Yeah, there's this blur that we see over the course of your book of, well, how is it that the AI became what it is? How
Mhm.
much of humanity is really in it?
Mhm.
Christelle herself has like this role where she is essentially really actively feeding data to this AI for years and has had jobs where she actually participates in the development of it and makes it become smarter.
Yeah.
So that's one way in which lines are blurred. There's also a real blurriness. I mentioned earlier, this is framed as a work of autofiction. And you've spoken before about the fact that some of these stories that your character Christelle tells in this book are very much things that did happen to you in your
Yeah.
real life and are real instances that you're recounting.
Yeah.
What is the connection between you and Christelle?
Oh, I mean, for the first half of the book, it's me.
Mm.
I mean, I think it's almost like one of those weird Marvel multiverse situations, right? Where it's sort of the same character that goes on a different timeline. So the basic ingredients are me. And then, of course, I imagine a future that hasn't happened yet. So it's me in a parallel world, in a parallel universe in a way. So I really imagine her with my thoughts and my reflexes. And as you can see, I'm not entirely kind to myself in the book. So that's and it's really funny actually, just as a weird I guess I don't know what it is, but some of the things that I've written, some of the dates I've put, I've even had some friends that are characters in the book. Some of these things are actually happening in their lives and in my life. Like right now, I am working on AI,
Mm.
selling it to clients, and so everything I was saying is actually happening to me. So it makes a very strange parallel.
There was even something because you said you were writing this book in 2020. It was
Mhm.
originally published first in French a couple years ago.
Yeah.
There's something in this book where there are tariffs being applied to estrogen and other exogenous hormones, and
Yeah.
it like is completely affecting the flow of trans people's medicine. And I'm like, the tariffs?
And the tariffs,
We
and I
didn't know
think I
there were going to be
imagine,
tariffs, but
yeah, exactly. And I imagine the tariffs during a trade war between North America and like Germany and China, which I mean, I don't know what, you know, I wish I could say I was sort of this, you know, well, there's two things. I would say one is I do strategy for a living, right?
mm,
So I do have I do, you know, communication strategy. So I do pay attention to what the trends are going, you know, because I companies come to us to figure out, you know, what comes next. So maybe there's a bit of foresight in there that is sort of my professional opinion of where the world is going. But then after that, I think it's just being a novelist, right? You go where
mhm,
the story goes, but then history goes where the story goes as well. And that's when you get that sort of weird echo between art and life.
mhm,
Because sometimes things can only go in one direction, right?
mm,
Um,
yeah. Chris Bergeron, in your book Valid, this is a real nightmarish situation that you've kind of concocted. It is a dystopian novel, but there is this current of love and hope, I would say, that lights up the story. And we have this beautiful, as they say in the community, T for T relationship
yeah.
with Christelle and Yukio, who's another trans woman. Why are these two drawn together?
Well, I can speak to why Christelle is drawn to Yukio. Um, why Yukio would fall in love with Christelle is I don't know. Probably because I just don't like myself enough that I would think that I would be worthy of such a, you know. But so basically Yukio, you know, what Christelle sees in Yukio, you know, who's an activist, an artist, somebody who is a house mother being somebody who takes care of other queer people in their community to the point of sometimes sheltering them, giving them money, finding ways to finance their transition and all of these things. Um, it's the kind of selfless actions that I would love to be good enough to take, but I'm too egotistical to actually spend the time and make the effort to do, right? So in a sense, Christelle sees her as a goal, as something to be. She's her superwoman in a sense, right? This sort of like larger than life character. And Yukio says, but you're putting me on a pedestal. Be careful, because I'm not this great saint that, you know, I'm not the sort of trans saintly mother, which is something that you see often when it comes to the representation of trans people as well, right? I mean, you've just seen it in the movie on Netflix, Perez.
Oh, Amelia Perez. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Oh my.
Amelia Perez, right? At the end, she's the sort of like Virgin Mary kind of character who is sacrificed. And so I wanted Yukio to be that trope, but also break that trope by her words and her actions and actually walking out on Christelle, because it's like, okay, you're not serious. You're not doing the work for yourself.
Hmm.
What she sees is this is who I could be. And what Yukio sees is this is what you could be as well, but you're not doing the work.
Hmm. Hmm. You mentioned earlier this idea of not wanting to speak for the whole community and recognizing sort of your own positionality, I suppose, as a trans woman relative to other trans women who maybe are not, you know, not being invited to give corporate talks, like let's say, not girl bossing their way through their transition, if I may speak so bluntly. There's this sense that your character, Christelle, feels guilty a bit about her position as somebody who, in her younger years, not where we meet her in the book, but for a big chunk of her life, was able to access gender affirming care, had health insurance, had a nice corporate job, was highly respected and protected in her community. And she has this kind of guilt knowing that for a lot of women like her, they don't get that same sort of respect and protection. Where does
Exactly.
that
I
guilt
mean,
come from exactly? Yeah, can you talk a bit about that?
it comes from lived experience, to be honest,
Mhm.
because I received an award a few by the Quebec Chamber of Commerce, the Quebec LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce, and it's these awards about, whatever, pioneers in business and blah blah blah. And it was for they were nominating these four trans women, and I looked at the four of us, and we were all white. We were all past our prime, we were all past 40, 50 and up. And we had all transitioned late in life, which meant that the bulk of our career had been as men. And so we benefited from that experience and the privilege that comes from that. And we built on that in order to maintain our status, right? But somebody that transitions young, somebody that is from, where there's an intersectionality, where it comes from a group where there might be racism or towards, or something like that, may not have the choice, may not to do that, and may not have these opportunities. So that's what I shed a light on, and that's why I try to portray Christelle not as a hero, but as somebody who hid a long time in order to keep her job. And then when the risk was at the lowest, came out as trans. But when the risk came back, started hiding again. So in
Mhm.
essence, the coward.
Yeah, it's sort of two different kinds of struggle and two different kinds of pain, right? People talk about visibility as something that is like a privilege in the sense of it's good to be visible, you want to be seen, but also it's something that can come with great risk, and that
Yes.
some people are visible even when they may not want to or are not given the choice. And so it's interesting, I think, like you have that dichotomy with Yukio, who's somebody who I think is living much more openly, hasn't had the ability to kind of like trade favors professionally and build a corporate career and access a lot of, the privilege of being a man who works in business. Whereas
Although she
Christelle
has a
is
bit of
somebody,
that because
yeah,
she's an artist and she sells her art to
that
business.
is true. Yeah. She's
So
girl bossing in a different way.
she's got that hustle.
Hmm.
Because the last thing I want to, I also want to, girl bossing in a sense has a negative, has a bad rep, but the community needs those positive examples. But we just have to be aware of how the girl bossing happened.
Yeah, not step on the girls who can't girl boss on your way up
Exactly.
to help them
Well,
up
that's it.
with you, right?
Exactly. You don't want to Caitlyn Jenner the whole thing.
No. I want to talk about the city of Montreal in the novel Valid because the city of Montreal feels to me like a character in this story. And you've actually said that you feel that Montreal is a transgender city,
Oh
which is
yeah.
really interesting. I've never heard someone describe a city as transgender before. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's either transgender or non-binary or, something like that. Because
Hmm.
first of all, I mean, nobody can figure out what it is, right? And in the book, I talk about it. I mean, it's French. It's the large French metropolis, but then it's got 800,000 not immigrants, sorry, Anglophones, right? And then that have been around for hundreds of years. And on top of that, it has another third of the population that comes from elsewhere in the world, first or second generation immigrants. So then is it that? No, it's not. It's something else. And then is it this, some would say it as a high-tech hub where there's a lot of AI labs and, aviation and all that. But then it's also like one of the poorest places in Canada. And it's all these things that at the same time. And it's been super cool when Arcade Fire was around, and then it got kind of, well, blah, who cares? And so it's always, and of course, the fact that it's always a giant construction site.
Hmm.
So
It's
it's
literally
always,
always transitioning. Yeah.
always transitioning. It's always going from one identity to another. And I saw it as, I saw it when it was, back in the 90s, sort of an indie quiet town with a lot of artists. And then it became, sort of a revolutionary left-wing hub back when we had, the Carré Rouge. And then it became a tech center. And then and it's always, or video game. Mecca, and because all the video games are built there, et cetera, et cetera. It just keeps so it's always trying to be something it's not, and it can't quite figure out what it is, and it's always a bit of a loser compared to the all the other cities, and that also makes it a bit trans because Toronto isn't trans, right?
I can't argue with that. No, I don't see Toronto as a transgender city.
Toronto is a guy, it's got a huge thing that stands upright in the middle of the city.
The
It
CN
wins.
Tower is quite phallic, you could
Yeah,
say.
it makes money. It's like it knows what it is, or at least it thinks it does. And we're the sort of eternal teenager with gender issues and identity issues that are like, what am I? Who am I? Who am I today? And there'll
Mhm.
probably never be an answer to that question, which is wonderful.
I want to ask a bit about some of the pop culture references that are in this novel because there's a really rich litany of pop culture references
But
from
you never
both
ask. I brought
English.
I brought
Oh my
Akira.
gosh, you've got Akira right in
I
front of
got
you.
Neuromancer right here. Yeah.
Wow. I was excited to see the Christine and the Queen's lyrics citation.
Yeah.
Very important artist for me. What role does pop culture and music play in this story for you?
So it's really funny because there are two schools of readers. Uh, some people say, well, I like your book, but I wish you would stop referring to all these pop culture moments. It's as if you're trying to show off your sort of culture, like what you've read and the bands you like, and But I used to run an alt weekly. I used to run this thing called Voir, which was kind of like Now in Toronto or the Georgia Straits in Vancouver. And so I spent the years between 2000 and, whatever, 2005, well, yeah, no, 2000 to 2010 in that world of music and and so yeah, obviously I spoke to all these artists and I got to interview them and I got to be with them and, follow their career. And so my connection to music is very powerful. And it's also the soundtrack to my moments of courage or fear, right? Like that song, La Marcheuse from Christine and the Queen, is actually something that I would listen to as I would walk down the street in my heels and my dress and having people stare at me, and I'm just listening to the song about a woman walking in the street and being stared at, right?
Hmm.
So I want to provide those cues as well because they say to me writing about a song in a pop culture, reference like Star Wars or whatever is it's just the same as somebody describing the sky, the impact of nature or the impact of a city and a street as you would have or in a normal normal no literary novel. But it's today the background of our lives is content.
Mm.
It's the thing that's always with us today. It's not nature anymore, sadly.
Hmm.
It's the things we listen to, on our iPhones, and it's the books we read and the movies we stream. I just watched an episode of Star Wars just right now before coming on the call, and it's always there.
The one thing that I want to ask before we get into the Q&A portion with our audience today is that we reach this sort of like breaking point at the end of your novel where it becomes really a novel about revolution without saying too much of exactly what happens.
Yeah.
This feels to me like a novel with a message, and I'm wondering, what does revolution mean for you as a trans person in 2025?
Oh, well, resist. I mean, and resist by existing is the message, right? So using words, using our stories, and telling our stories, no matter the risk, because the risk is going to be there. And if we, sh but I find, and that's why the system collapses under the weight of uh, the words of people who are, in marginalized communities. In my book, that's how the revolution happened. People telling their stories to this AI who can't process these things. I think today our words are just as powerful because the Trumps of this world have been elected because of words. And we seem to forget that, that we've our words are just as powerful. So speak
Mm.
out.
All right. Well, that feels like a fantastic note to end this portion of the conversation on. The Q&A, I believe, is open for audience questions if folks have questions that they would like to submit. Um, I will field them and deliver them to Chris. I'm not current. I haven't used Zoom Q&A in a hot minute. So,
Let's see what's happening. Would they pop in the Q&A box?
mm.
Oh, there's one.
Oh, okay. We have a first question. And again, yeah, please don't be shy. If there's anything that you want to ask me or Chris, but mostly Chris, please go ahead and type it in. The first question that we have is, how did you find the translation process, and what did your translator bring to the story, if anything? I love asking these questions actually because I'm always really curious. I read the book in English
Hmm.
and I was thinking to myself, like I wonder what this would have been in French, and I could see certain things of how I might reverse engineer it back into French myself.
Yeah, and that was a big concern because my book is very French, and it's very French in a sort of literary French from France kind of thing because my parents are from France, and so I there is there's a lot of references to the Three Musketeers and Alexandre Dumas, and like this because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do a queer Three Musketeers. Like that's my point. I want to do this sort of like queer 19th century epic novel universe for trans people. That would be my ultimate goal. And so I was like, well, people will the translator pick up on that old-fashioned idea? And I think she did. I think Natalia did a great job. And it's funny because obviously the first reflex is to be super involved, right? And so my first reflex was to talk to my publisher and say, okay, well, how come I'm not seeing anything? Like, do we want to have coffee or do we want to, really? And the answer was no. She let her do her stuff, let her cook. And essentially that's what I did. I let her cook. And I think I read I made a couple of corrections, but not that many. And as soon as somebody else takes the book, and turns it into something else. Like for instance, right now it's been adapted for the cinema, so it's turned into a scenario, and it's the same thing. The script writer, I was like, okay, let him cook, right? And he's changed so many things. And but because it's going to be a new story that's going to go into the hands of a director, same thing, same process. So you have to respect the translator and respect their skill. And she did a
Mm.
wonderful job at it.
Next question that we have is, how do you feel seeing that some things which belong to the future in the book are now happening? And then specifically thinking partly about there's a tariff war taking place in the book,
Yeah.
which you would have written before the current trade war that we're experiencing.
I'm not, I mean, so you were mentioning, there's a sense of hope in the book, and there is in some ways that could be considered, more hope punk than cyberpunk. And yet, I wrote these things because I believed a lot of them would happen. Because strategically, if I looked at where the world was going, to me, that was a possible outcome. Then, of course, you run the risk of being completely ridiculous, right? When you read Jules Verne and his prediction for the 20th century, it's kind of comical. And sometimes you catch up on a thing, oh, that actually happened, right? So eventually you have to sort of go, well, screw it. I'm just going to predict the future and see what happens. And so there's a sense of winning when something happens, and obviously of great despair because you were hoping that it wouldn't happen. Um, so pride and despair, I suppose, is a feeling I'm left with when I
Mm,
see something actually happening that I wrote down.
yeah. Two conflicting emotions, I imagine. Next question that we have is, are you working on another book or any other upcoming project you could share with us?
Oh, for sure. Well, I mean, first of all, there are two other books in French that are in the valid universe. One is called Vaillant, and it's a prequel, and it's a it's in French, beautiful love story. Well, I think it's my best book between two astronauts who fall in love, lady astronauts that fall in love, and one of them has a terrible fatal accident, and it's about their last moment together and the last science experience. So I try to write my own, Petit Prince, uh,
Yeah.
it's sort of very lovely and airy and poetic and yet very sci-fi. And then there's the sequel to both these books called where the characters of Valiant and Valid well, you find out what happens to them. It takes place a year after, and that's called Vandals. I'm hoping that one day they would be translated into English. And in the fall, I'm going to have a new book that is out of the sort of V universe that I'm building, and it's called Fake, and it's an essay essentially saying how it's impossible to be authentic in today's world. And so we just have our duty then is to pick a narrative, a fake version of us that does good instead of harm.
Mm.
And so I'm writing a sort of literary poetic essay around that with illustrations, little drawings that I made. And then I'm going to get back to this universe. I want to write a novel about Yukio. That's going to be called Variant, and that's coming out probably in the next 2 years. And I've asked other authors in Quebec to write books in my universe. So I really want to build this sort of Marvel-like structure where others get to write in my world.
Oh,
I want to be like a
okay.
trans Stan Lee.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, yes, if you enjoyed this book, then lots of other titles to look out
And Valid
for,
is,
things
is
to,
eventually, yeah, sorry, Valid is eventually going to go to the movies because I'm
yeah, it's
hoping that.
plenty of things to be excited about. That's fantastic and amazing that you're able to balance that with doing other work that isn't, literary creative. I wish I had the energy to keep that many irons in the fire at the same time. My God.
I'm
Um,
very tired.
oh, aren't we all? Next question that we have on the docket. There's a few great references to fear and anger in your novel. Would you be willing to share a time when so-called negative emotions have benefited you?
Hmm. Yeah, the mix of fear of anger that I can, that question brings to mind the most, I think, is actually the moment where I said, "Oh, what the hell? Let's just go for it." Right? I had lost my job as an editor, and that was my dream to do what you do, Matteo, to be behind a microphone or a pen and write stories and talk to artists. And when I realized that that door was closed just because I was trans, now this was God, 15 years ago. So obviously the landscape has changed. But in those days, people like me or us, should I say, could not hold these kind of positions. And so that made me angry because it's taking all my work and putting it, I'd worked a lot and just throwing it and admitting that it had no value in the context. And so then there was the fear of not being myself and the fear of being unhappy, trying to fit in, trying to be accepted by these people who clearly weren't going to do it. And so anger and fear were very much the pillars on which my sort of rebirth was set upon.
Mm. We have a follow-up talking about pop culture. Earlier, you mentioned the role of pop culture in your life and the influence of pop culture on this novel. And so we have a question asking, is there anything that you're watching or listening to or reading these days that you might want to shout out or recommend?
Oh boy. God, it's funny because I'm always reading and my memory is always a little bit blank. Right now, I'm reading The Inconvenient Indian, which is a classic Thomas King book. And there's one sentence that really got to me. And when he mentions indigenous cultures as being seen as furniture, people that you move around for the benefit of the majority, right? And I find that that is also how the state and politicians see queer people, furniture, right? Uh, Not so much people you want to oppress directly, but certainly people you want to get out of the way, right? Let's not be too noisy. Let's not clash with the room so much. So maybe we'll put you in another room somewhere else. And that's what they're trying to do, so much so that, like a piece of furniture, they're actually blocking our access to certain rooms, like bathrooms, right? It's like, oh, that doesn't go in there. So that's one sentence that really got to me recently. I mean, and if not, well, I mean, I love the work of N.K. Jemisin, the Broken Earth trilogy. There's a lot of beautiful queer sci-fi that exist as there, and then the classics, right? I mean, I brought Neuromancer here. I mean, it's a very sexist book, right? But just the opening, when he says that the sky was gray, like a TV turned right, without reception or something like that. I mean, that's just like such a killer way of starting a novel, and his description of uh, just the digital world. And I play a lot of cyberpunk, and of course I'm writing and I'm reading, not reading, sorry, watching the second season of Andor, and I'm freaking out. It's wonderful. It's really good.
Mm.
Mm.
Um, we have a question you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the relationship between transness and technology, that it was trans women who created the Matrix, and we have a question about the Wachowski sisters sort of peripherally. Um, the question is your V trilogy a reference to V for Vendetta in any way? I think that the film screenplay was written by the Wachowski sisters. Is the connection
Yeah,
there?
yeah, and Alan Moore for the actual book. Um, so sadly, no. It was actually something where I thought, oh, maybe it's a little too close to V for Vendetta. So, I mean, it came from two things. One is valid was a word that was important because there's a part in the book that says we're always looking to validate each other in the community. I'm valid, you're valid, and I thought that word was being was sort of taking so much space in our world. And my publisher actually said maybe you should call it valid. And then if we want to go into my very private life, um, when before I transitioned, I went out with this girl called Valerie, and we broke up. And now a year after that, I lost my job, and all of everything accelerated. And I was like, oh, that's kind of a cool turning point as well. Don't worry, it's been 20 years ago. I'm well over her and I'm happy in love today. But I thought it'd be fun to refer to an influx, like a key part of my life. But yeah, there's something in the V that I don't know why resonates with people. V for Vendetta, the V of victory. In the video game Cyberpunk 2077, the character is named V, and it just keeps popping up in our culture for some reason, especially in sci-fi. There must be something.
There must be some, yeah. Well, that's a kind of fun question, I think, to wrap things up on. Chris, thank you so much for your engagement with my questions and for taking these audience questions and for your work. This has been such a treat getting to chat with you. And I think we're going to toss it back to Sonia just to give us a quick concluding message.
Thank you. Yeah, it really has been a treat of a conversation springing from such a prescient and courageous novel. And Chris, you talked about courage. I would say this is a very courageous novel. So thank you, and thanks to you both. To everyone who joined us tonight, thank you for being part of this celebration of Canadian literature and of the shared reading experiences that bring us closer. And thanks as well to Culk. Events like One eRead, Un Livrel Canada remind us that stories start important conversations, and that libraries and their collections of diverse formats such as ebooks are essential for making stories accessible to all. Doubtless tonight's discussion has inspired you, so please keep the conversation going in your local libraries, and of course, please keep reading. N'oubliez pas, Bibliothèque et Archives nationales du Québec is hosting the One eRead un Livrel Canada event in French tomorrow, April 24th at 7 p.m., featuring again Chris and host Catherine Verrebely. As you've heard, Chris brings a unique voice to the literary landscape, so it promises to be another engaging conversation, and one in French, which will be interesting given the genesis of this novel. So thank you again to Matea and to Chris, and thank you everyone for spending your evening with us tonight. This concludes our program. Bonne soirée. Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bonne soirée.